A very warm welcome to all our viewers on yet another session of our Fair AI's Thought Leader Speak series. We have with us today Mr. Mark Caine. He's the lead for artificial intelligence and machine learning at the World Economic Forum. And we will talk with him about WEF's work in the domain of AI, especially focusing on responsible use of AI. Welcome to the show, Mark.
Thanks. It's a pleasure to be with you today.
Thank you. So first of all, let's start with your journey in AI and what got you excited about this domain in the first place.
Sure. So for me, it all started actually outside of the AI space. I spent the vast majority of the early part of my career focused on another kind of existential challenge for humanity, which is climate change. And it may sound like, what does climate change have to do with AI? They are ostensibly quite different things, but of course there are a number of overlaps and a number of interesting ways in which they connect. Not least that AI is potentially one of the most useful technologies that we can use to help improve and develop new solutions to climate change. But mainly, I think the journey for me from one to the other was that both involve really complex challenges that can't be addressed probably by just one type of stakeholder. So climate change is a classic example where a government alone is insufficient to solve the problem. There is a very robust and important role for government in helping drive down the cost of cleaner technologies, perhaps in putting some prices on some of the more dirty technologies and emissions, but without a really robust collaboration between the public sector, the private sector, academic research, technologists, and others, ethicists, academics, etc., it's really going to be very difficult to come to a good global solution path for climate change. And what I found as I was working on that issue, and I was in government for most of my career within the Foreign Office of the UK government, working on their climate and energy diplomacy around the world. I also spent some time in the developing world, based in Addis Ababa, Ethiopia, working with African governments to think through their decarbonization strategies. It became very, very clear that this was going to have to be a multi-year, multi-stakeholder effort that is going to be sustained and is really going to bring together policy, but also industry, practice, and also technology and law and many other domains. It's very interdisciplinary. And what I saw, in AI, as AI rose up the kind of consciousness of policymakers and industry, it seemed to me to be a very similar challenge. It's multidisciplinary in nature. To ensure that AI is responsible obviously requires the participation of industry, companies who are developing AI, engineers themselves. But there's also a very important role for government to play. There's an important role for civil society to play. There's an important role even for the public to play, for citizens who are using these technologies or who are on the receiving end of AI technologies being used by others. And so it seemed to me that a lot of the same kinds of frameworks and thinking were going to be needed to help us, steer the AI sector towards a responsible, ethical future. And so for me, this is how I entered AI was through the climate side. And one of my pet issues within the AI space, and we can come back to this perhaps later, is trying to do whatever I can to try to bring those worlds together and think about how can AI technologies be stimulated to start helping us more with addressing some of our environmental problems, particularly climate change, but not limited to that. But I'll leave that for perhaps later in the conversation.
Sounds fantastic. In fact, it's interesting you mentioned about the point of multiple stakeholders and the private sector, public sector, all of them playing a role together. And it reminded me of my own career journey because I spent a lot of time in the private sector and moved to the sustainability and climate space. And that is how I also got involved with the Fair AI project also, because like you mentioned, there are some overlaps. And I still remember one of the initial questions that I had asked someone, I mean, almost a couple of years ago, that give me two, three examples where it overlaps. And they gave a couple of examples, which was, the AI-based tool that measures cloud movements to track where the next cyclonic or the weather incidents will happen, because those are changing as per the climate change things, and how that affects the agriculture space. And very, very innovative startups have come up, for example, especially in the developing world in India, etc., who are actually solving very niche problems in these overlapping areas. So it's very interesting times I think we live in. I think we are very lucky that we were born and living in this time when a lot of stuff is happening around us. But
Yeah, absolutely. I may just add to that, a couple of other just quick examples, because I think it's such a fascinating and important topic. Already, I think we've seen a lot of use of computer vision, which is often built upon machine learning algorithms for classifying different soil types from satellite imagery or from drone imagery, which allows for a more optimized planting of a particular area of farm for different types of crops. We have seen also deep learning and machine learning unleashed on the operations of data centers and other energy intensive facilities to essentially optimize the way in which they use energy to accomplish the same kinds of computing tasks, but perhaps doing it at different times of day, or you're just optimizing the way that cooling is done across a large space. And in some of these cases, virtually nothing has to be done to the physical infrastructure. It's literally just unleashing the algorithms onto an existing operational process, and in many cases, double-digit efficiency gains have been achieved from that, in excess of 30%. And so this is just an example of, obviously there are a lot of changes that we need to make, to our infrastructure, to the way that we do things from a climate perspective, and AI, can really help us get there. And perhaps even beyond. I'll mention one last thing, before we dive in further, which is on this agriculture topic. I'm glad you mentioned it. In India, where I know you're based, we have recently started scoping a new project looking at AI for agricultural innovation. So trying to understand what are some of those practices that are out there that are already being used that could be scaled up to a larger amount of farmers or technologists that are focusing on farms, but also looking at what are some of those kind of emerging, more blue sky areas where we could be stimulating more activity by technologists and AI developers to try to address some of those agricultural problems. I think that area has huge promise, and it's something that I personally and we at the World Economic Forum would love to see more focus and attention on, and we're doing, starting to do our part to try to amplify that.
Yeah, you cannot ignore agriculture in a country of 1.3 billion. So it is synonymous. But Mark, let's move to the topic of responsible and ethical use of AI, or rather, at a more generic level, a responsible and ethical use of technologies, all these new technologies. So how can we make the issue of ethics more synergistic to how these new technologies are being used? So what are your some of the examples that you might have had from your experiences at WEF?
Sure. It's a very big question, and it's a complex question. Anytime ethics comes into the picture, we could have an entire conversation just about this question. And there's a reason why it's complicated. Ethics, to begin with, are not necessarily universal. Oftentimes the first response to the discussion about ethics is, well, whose ethics? And, different people have different values. There are some kind of universal ethics in certain places and certain points in time, but it has, it's a complicated discussion. But I would say, directly to your question, in terms of how are we trying to synergize or align ethical ideas and principles and practices with the actual development and use of AI technologies, we're working at it in a number of different ways. Number one, we're working very closely with the actual developers and users of AI technology in both the public sector and the private sector, across a number of different projects that focus on different aspects of the problem or the issue and different kind of levers to pull on to try to get ethics really incorporated into the decision making of those who are using AI. So for just a couple of examples, on the private sector side, we have a project called the Responsible Use of Technology Project, which is led by a colleague of mine who is a secondee from Salesforce, one of our partners. And he is basically looking at a number of different areas of corporate operations, principally in the tech industry, but also in adjacent industries, to try to find what are those key points in the product development lifecycle for an AI technology where there ought to be some checks and some review opportunities and some clarification, so that there are certain criteria that can be brought in at those points where a product can be assessed for how ethical it is, and is it being developed in accordance with the intentions in terms of responsible use and ethics of that company. And so there are a few different work streams within that project. One is focusing on the product development cycle itself, so the actual product level. But another is looking kind of one concentric circle out at the organizational design. So looking at some of the organizational processes and policies that create incentives or don't create incentives for employees to raise their hand when they see something that looks like it could go into a negative direction in terms of how a product may perform in the real world. So we're looking at it at a number of levels just within that project, looking at the product itself, the organization around it, and then some of the questions around partnerships and looking at, so for example, if a company is developing a technology that it is then selling to others who are then using it themselves, what kind of responsibility does that vendor have, and what kind of parameters can they put in place to ensure that their customer then uses that product responsibly? I'll say just a couple more things on this question because it's a fascinating one, and I won't go into an exhaustive list. I do recommend your viewers, if they would like to really dig into our work on these topics, can feel free to check out our website. It's at World Economic Forum, easy to find on Google. There's a section on artificial intelligence and machine learning. But just on the private sector side, still for a moment, we also are looking at the opposite side of that equation. So for example, for companies who are not developing AI themselves, but who are procuring it on the market and then planning to use it with their own data or data that isn't sort of coming along with it. There are a number of unique issues that presents from an ethical perspective. And so we're working to help those kinds of companies to be asking the right questions as they procure technology on the market to make sure that those technologies that they're buying satisfy their sort of ethical criteria and their responsible use criteria before they make those purchases. And there is, I think, a couple of elements of why we think that's useful. One is that obviously for those companies, they don't want to make bad business decisions, and they don't want to, sort of risk their reputation or the health and safety of their customers by procuring a product that isn't designed ethically. At the same time, we also see it as having real value as a tool of governance, a soft governance tool. If companies won't procure technologies that don't clear a certain bar for ethical design and responsible use, that is a signal to the marketplace that companies ought to be, who are vendors of AI technologies, ought to be developing technologies that do clear that bar. And so we hope that through the purchasing decisions of companies who are acquiring these technologies on the market, that will send a sort of signal to the companies who are vendors who are developing these technologies that they really need to take this ethical and responsible use question very seriously. The last thing I'll say on this topic, and again, there's a lot more on our website. We're working on various aspects of this issue, virtually every day across almost 12, full active projects. But we're working also with the public sector side of the equation. In a lot of countries, India is one of them, the government is one of the largest procurers of technology, whether it's through the national health services or through the military or through any number of other functions that the government performs, where AI can bring a lot of value from an efficiency perspective or an optimization perspective or just an improvement of the quality of outcomes perspective. And again, that positions the government as a very important market actor, in addition to its traditional role as a regulator, a policymaker, law enforcer, etc. And so we're working with governments. We've done a big project with the government of the UK, which we are currently scaling and expanding to other governments around the world, where we looked at procurement guidelines for AI technologies, essentially to help governments figure out what the risks and the opportunities are for themselves as they buy AI technologies from third-party vendors, and to think about the ways in which they can use that procurement process to exert some governance and some sort of parameter setting onto the market. In the UK, for example, if the National Health Service, which is a massive organization, a huge purchaser, says, we won't purchase AI that doesn't meet these minimum qualifications, that sends a huge signal to the market that it's probably not even worth developing products that don't meet that bar. Not only will the government buy it, but a lot of other organizations, they actually just index their own purchasing requirements to what they see in the government. The government is really a kind of leader in some of this stuff. And so that is another way where we try to really look, one level beneath the ethical principles. There's been a lot of discussion about ethical principles for AI, which is great. We really welcome it. We did a bit of a survey earlier in the year, and we found that there were over 175 different sets of ethical principles that have been put together by different companies, different organizations, etc. And we welcome it. It's fantastic. I think it's really great that people are thinking seriously about what principles we ought to follow as we develop and use AI technologies. But what we're trying to do is to really take it one step further and to figure out, how do you move from principles to practice? How do you operationalize those principles through specific decision-making processes, whether at the government or the corporate level, that help you drive the outcomes that you want to see. So that's just a kind of overview, but happy to go into more depth on any aspect of it at any point.
Yeah, in fact, there are a couple of threads from your the points that you just mentioned that probably we'll ask you later in the conversation. One is on the checks and monitoring part of it. One is, on the stakeholder engagements that you've had. But let me come back to one of the initial points you had made, that ethics is not a very universal topic. So yeah, so the question of ethics is extremely subjective. What's right for me may not be right for you, and that creates a lot of challenges in the domain of AI, for example, for the developers. Then how do you think that for the developer, how tough or how possible is the right word here, it is to incorporate so many subjective scenarios into whatever algorithm they are developing? What is your view on that? Because to be fair to the developers, they are faced with a very challenging task to ensure that whatever they are doing is ethical for each and every customer across geographies, across a lot of demographic profiles, and ethics vary as per segments. So how can you make that task easier in your view?
Yeah, it's a great question, and I wish I had a better answer to it. I do agree. It is hard to build products that have universality when there is such difference across different cultures, across different individuals. I'm reminded of a phrase that's often taught in design schools, which is that if you try to design for everyone, you end up designing for no one. And I think that there is an element of it that is, part of this answer, which is I am not, in my personal view, sure that a developer can necessarily satisfy every potential user in terms of adhering to all of the possible ethical principles or views that every possible user might have. I think what would be helpful from the perspective of society, but also for the developers themselves, is number one, for it to be very clear what the requirements are. And that's typically done through law or regulation or policy, ostensibly, at least in democratic countries, reflecting some sort of process where people have had the opportunity to collectively say what they want and what they value. So to have very clear parameters about what's required by a developer in terms of not having bias or not having discrimination or et cetera, et cetera. So what are the actual laws? Similar to how any other product, we have laws in place that when you go and you buy a refrigerator, for example, it needs to meet certain tolerances, in terms of not electrocuting you or, lighting your house on fire or whatnot. Some of that is through standards, but some is through, consumer protection laws, et cetera. So we need to have some of that in place. That will help developers, I think, is having a more clear legal framework so that at least they understand where liability is and where, there is really a risk of, of actually sort of having a enforcement where the product is non-compliant with the law. But it does go beyond that, right? So what if they're legally compliant, but people don't perceive of the product as being ethical? Well, that's a problem as well from a kind of business point of view. If a company or a product doesn't have the social license to operate, then they will suffer from that in the marketplace. And so I think, to me, I don't have a complete answer to your question. One thing that is important, though, I think, and potentially valuable for the developers and from the developer perspective, is just to have more disclosure and to have more transparency. So it may be that they can't meet every possible ethical need or desire of every customer, but if they make explicit what their parameters are and where they stand, then at least at that point consumers can be educated and can understand what they're interacting with or what they're purchasing or what they're opting into when they choose to use a product or a service that is using AI. I know that some companies, including one of our partners, IBM, has started to develop, I believe they call them fact sheets, which can be viewed publicly online. It's essentially a nutritional label, which I find to be an interesting kind of model for this, where essentially, it's very easy to digest and understand, but it says on there, sort of what the algorithm is doing in layman's terms, what kind of data it's going to use of you, how that data will or will not be shared, what kinds of time periods that data will be held onto for, et cetera, et cetera. A lot of it concerns the data. The algorithms themselves, it's a little bit harder given there's an evolutionary kind of emergent quality to algorithms. They change as they assimilate data. The nutritional label may have to be a little bit more dynamic than it may be on a can of tomatoes or something. But I think that this element this element of disclosure and transparency, I think, will help go some of the way towards resolving that question of sort of differential ethical views amongst consumers. But I would be curious for your thoughts or those of your viewers on how we can do even more in this domain. I think it's a very open question right now, and one that we would welcome certainly input and insight onto ourselves.
In fact, the first thought that came to my mind when you said 175 different standards on ethics, on business responsibility, for example. So business responsibility disclosures have been picking up. It picked up in Europe, picking up in other parts of the world. including in India. There are over 1,000 standards.
Wow.
So I was just thinking that, how much more complicated aligning a disclosure framework when you have so many different variants of standards and criteria across the world. So yes, it's in fact probably my view on that would be that there's not much the developer can do for it. I mean, like you rightly mentioned, it requires another party as the oversight, or to provide that disclosure oversight or standards oversight. And that is probably where, one of the points you had mentioned previously on how different stakeholders are able to work together, stakeholders from different domains, and that they understand digital business. For example, digital and business was very two different things till 5 years ago, but today we have chief digital business officers, something that didn't exist 5 years ago. So let me, in fact, here talking on stakeholders, let me move to the other thread that had struck us. That I mean, at WEF, you are engaging on a daily basis with so many different stakeholders, big and small, cutting across sectors, across geographies. So based on those experiences, which sort of companies, applications, or organizations do you think really stand out when it comes to ethical based approaches to artificial intelligence?
Sure. Yeah. So it's a big question, and I'll just pepper in a few examples. I think we have, I think, in the last couple of years, seen a real sea change, actually, where the question of ethical and responsible AI has gone from being a sort of nice to have, I guess you could say, where it was sort of thought about or talked about in the same way that corporate social responsibility was talked about in the sustainability space maybe 10 years ago. It was sort of potentially a positive branding differentiator. It was a nice public relations message. And it was, just sort of something that was often relegated to the marketing department to kind of use as part of the language to describe a company's mission or a product. That has decisively changed in the last couple of years. And what we've seen is that companies that did not take this issue seriously have suffered in the marketplace and in the reputation department. And it has therefore, I think, really moved to be kind of, at the center of decision making and really kind of a key priority for a number of different companies. Some of the things that we've seen recently that have been, I think, really important moments were earlier this year, a number of different tech companies either stopped or paused their development of facial recognition technologies. IBM was really out ahead of that. IBM has been out ahead on a lot of AI issues and have a really unique legacy, I think, as a kind of long-standing technology player. Who's been around 10, 20 times longer than many tech companies, and have really, developed a lot of very sophisticated capabilities in terms of both the technology itself, but also in terms of thinking about how it's used and kind of how it affects society, and how stakeholders and customers can be involved in that process. So IBM, that's who was developing the fact sheets that I mentioned in my last answer. I've been very impressed and inspired by their work. So that is, I guess, the kind of macro trend, right, is from a kind of nice to have to a must have. I think that we've seen all of the major tech companies based here in San Francisco, virtually all of them, Facebook, Apple, Netflix, Google, have really strengthened their capabilities and their kind of in-house expertise around the issue of responsible use and AI ethics. And I would commend all of them really for really starting to take this issue very seriously and to think about it again, kind of one level or multiple levels below the question of what principles should we adhere to, but to really think about at the nitty-gritty level of product design and implementation, how do you actually make that real in the world, and how do you assess it, and how do you track it over time, and how do you manage it? So that's been very exciting. And what I think I'm seeing now are kind of two things that I think are giving me a lot of hope. So on the one hand, we work with a lot of startups, a lot of companies that probably many of your viewers wouldn't have heard of yet. Hopefully we'll be hearing about soon, because some of them are really just absolutely amazing. And in the startup space, we're seeing a lot of companies that are either doing AI for something beneficial, so AI for water management, or for health improvements of some kind. So that's really positive. So it's a bit of a different angle on ethical AI. It's not necessarily looking at how to reduce the risk and the harm of the use of AI for something else, but it's how do you leverage AI to do something beneficial and positive for the environment or for health. So we've seen a lot of that, and they're obviously thinking very much from a responsible use perspective as they do that. Oftentimes the issues aren't as sticky in those spaces, particularly environment, because you're not talking about people's personal data or their health data, in the way that you see when you're talking about some of the health applications or even social media or others. So we've been very heartened to see the startup activity in that direction, and then also within the startup space, a lot of companies who are actually trying to make it easier for other companies to develop their AI ethically. So they are producing kind of audit tools, self-assessment tools, ways to track how a product is being used over time, so that there can just be more of a kind of accountability in the use of AI by other companies, and they're often using AI to do that. So it's kind of a cool use of the technology to help make a different instantiation of it be more responsibly used. And the last thing I'll say on this is that we have, I think, really seen in the last couple of years, and I think it's accelerating, that AI is being used across a lot of different industries, and that's not new, but it is really accelerating. And it's very clear, I think, at this point, that there's a strong value proposition from a pure business case perspective in a number of different industries outside of the traditional technology industry for using AI. So whether it's in health and healthcare, whether it's in automotive or transport, insurance and finance, many other industries. And it could be as simple as just installing a chat bot on the website to help out with customer service. But it could also be essentially an entire retooling of a company's operations to be much more data-driven, as kind of a next phase of a digitalization process. As you said, a lot of the companies have sort of digitized in the last 10 years outside of the tech space, and now they're really becoming AI companies, or at least AI-driven companies. And what we're seeing as that happens, and this is something I'm personally working on a lot now, is that those companies, they have seen the business case for adopting AI very readily. And it's very clear what the benefits are, but they don't necessarily have as much experience thinking about what are the ethical challenges and what are the responsible use considerations that ought to be taken into account. And so we're trying to really cultivate a kind of culture of exchange and shared learning between companies across sectors, so that the companies who have already done a lot of good work in this domain, whether it's Salesforce or IBM or Google or others, can share those best practices with companies that are coming up on AI in other sectors, but don't necessarily have a large staff of in-house technology ethicists the way that some tech companies do. And so, I'm very hopeful, and I think that some of these other industries are actually going to end up leading the way on this, particularly because some of them have such strong relationships with their customers and their consumers already. If you look at some of the automotive companies, for example, I mean, people have a real, sort of customer relationship, almost an emotional relationship with, whether it's Ford or Tata or whoever else. Some people that, they buy the same car their entire life, or it's the same with some of these other products with their bank, for example. I mean, they have very close relationships. And so I am really hopeful that as these other kind of tech industry adjacent companies and industries really roll out AI, that they're actually going to help move the whole AI space towards a greater degree of attention to responsible use that is really human-centered and really takes into account the preferences and the needs and the priorities of the end user, which is, I think, what a lot of this is all about.
Yeah, Mark, so tech giants is definitely one that you mentioned, startups. And then obviously the follow-up on that, which you yourself have answered, is about the old school industries. So for example, you mentioned about automotive, the car sector, or the banking financial sector, which I think that's a good way of describing it, tech adjacent. But let me also take very quickly what your views is on the SME space. So the SME space, which is a major job creator for most countries, whether it is in America or in India, China, etc. How do you view their actions on responsible use of new technologies, especially responsible AI for that matter? What's your view on that? Any examples you feel on that space?
Sure. So SMEs are absolutely critical, in my view, to responsible use and development of technology. I think you're right to point out that from a job creation and a just an economic vibrancy perspective, SMEs are really the lifeblood of any economy, and it is, I think, absolutely vital that SMEs be supported and encouraged as they complete their own digital transformation and their own move into AI. And it's one of the challenges that I see in the AI space is that there are real returns to scale when it comes to AI, both in terms of building an organizational team around developing and managing implementation of AI, but also around dealing with some of the ethical issues that come up. And of course, that's not even to begin talking about the scale advantages that you get based on having a huge amount of data that you can use to train and use AI on. And so, in a sense, I think that SMEs are in a challenged place, structurally slightly disadvantaged here, because most of them don't have the kind of in-house resources to really be on the cutting edge of AI development or use. And so I think it's actually, an important priority for policymakers that I would like to see rise further up the agenda, is to figure out how to support SMEs more in both figuring out how to harvest the benefits of AI from a pure operational and business point of view, and also to do that in a responsible way. I'll point to one project we have been working for many years with the government of Brazil, in particular in the state of Sao Paulo. And we have mainly been focused on Internet of Things and connected devices with them, so a little bit less in the AI space. But the project that we did with them was focused on helping SMEs basically, modernize and digitalize their services and incorporate more IoT technologies into their traditional operations and product lines. And we looked at a couple of different sectors, including the hospital sector, and what we found is that there's actually a really high appetite amongst SMEs to both, digitize and to adopt new technologies, and also to do it in a responsible and ethical way. Actually, even more so than the companies I mentioned before, these sort of legacy consumer-facing companies. SMEs also, they have very close relationships with their customers, with their suppliers. They're really embedded in the communities that they serve, and so for them, responsibility is often, second nature. It's not a sort of faraway entity that no one has an interaction with. Often the CEO of an SME is also, part of the city council, or goes to the the school. The children go to school with all everyone else, and so there's a real embeddedness, and so. We have seen, I think, that the appetite is there and the desire is there. And I think the missing piece right now, and some countries and some industries are doing it better than others, but I think there is a lot of potential, and it would be great to see more in terms of helping SMEs to get there. And I think it does really start with the kind of utilization and the adoption of these technologies, because if they're not even yet aware of the benefits or the possible benefits of using AI, then the conversation about using it responsibly is a bit premature. And so I think those things ideally can come together, in education, training, kind of capacity building at that level, where they can understand both, the benefits of using AI and understand, the best practices for, okay, so if you're going to use it, how do you make sure you use it responsibly?
So in fact, Mark, here I'll go back to one of the earlier points you had mentioned about the checks and balances. The point of monitoring, that a concept may have been implemented very well, but whether it is actually implemented very well cannot be understood till it is monitored properly. And probably that creates, for example, when you mentioned about CSR, so new solutions create new problems. So often, for example, say in CSR, I myself was writing a paper once, and I was flabbergasted when I saw some data that showed that in India, for instance, the listed companies of the main stock exchange, the amount of CSR spendings, because 2% of net profit is supposed to be used for CSR, it's increased almost like 70 or 80% in the last 5 years. Most of it goes into health and education, but India's score on the UNDP Human Development Improvement score, that score has improved only 6% in that same period. And CSR has been one of the major funding channels for that. So let me come to this issue of monitoring. For example, say obviously in India, the CSR monitoring, something has been amiss. In the space of AI, how do you find the companies you are engaging with? How do you find them doing this aspect, monitoring that? Are they really doing the ethical practices or not? What are your views on that?
It's a great question, and it's funny you mentioned this example. It sounds like we share some background, and this is something that I've seen in my previous focus on climate change. Is that number one, monitoring and evaluation are absolutely critical, because if you're not doing an effective job of that, then you really just have no idea how you're doing. And number two, it's very hard to do. And it is also prone to gaming of different kinds. It's prone to abuses. There's an entire cottage industry that sprouted up in the climate and the kind of carbon auditing area to actually just make sure that companies are doing what they say they're doing, particularly around the clean development mechanism and other kind of financial incentives that were put in place for certain kinds of activities to clean up company operations. So there have, I think, been a lot of lessons, and somebody should write the book or the academic article about the lessons from the monitoring and evaluation of the clean development mechanism for AI. Perhaps that's our next collaboration. But what I would say is this for now. I think that it's a work in progress. I think that different companies are trying different approaches. Some of them are focusing on self-assessment and self-reporting with the view that just transparency is critical, and that if they just sort of flag what they're doing, and just make it public. That is a sort of accountability mechanism, and so they've put in place self-assessment and reporting frameworks for themselves, and they're publishing that often in an annual report. Other companies are inviting third-party auditors to come in and to assess the way that they're doing this. And I believe that some of the large accounting and kind of audit firms around the world are developing kind of product lines or service lines to do these kind of audits and these evaluations from a kind of independent, non, biased perspective. And so, some companies are taking that route, and obviously, having a third party be the one conducting the assessment and the audit, I think at least creates the appearance of a greater degree of objectivity compared to self-assessment. And then others are, and these are not mutually exclusive. I think some companies are probably doing all three all at once. Others are working together, and this is something that we're involved in a little bit and are hoping to be more involved in developing kind of certification processes and mechanisms where there are, and this is, it's related to monitoring. It comes a little bit before, essentially the certification creates the parameters and the metrics that are then monitored and evaluated once that certification has been granted to a product or a service. We see that is something that companies seem to be increasingly interested in. Certification has the benefit of being not specific to a single company, so it's possible that you could start to see some kind of more like industry-wide or sector-wide standards developing, the same way that we've seen in, for example, electronics, where, products that plug into your plugs have all been certified in the US by the Underwriters Laboratory to essentially guarantee that they're not going to blow up your house or start a fire. It is, I think, challenging, and we're finding that it's a very unique challenge, really, to do certification for ethics. Historically, most certification has been done for safety or for other kind of more easily measurable parameterized criteria like that. So certification is one piece of it, and as part of those certification processes, some of them are incorporating a monitoring regimen into those certifications. So to maintain your certification, there's an audit that either has to be done, in a self-assessment kind of way or by a third party. And so, we're seeing it develop as we speak. And I haven't seen yet any kind of real standardization across the industry in terms of monitoring or measurement or evaluation. I'm hopeful, though, that we're kind of entering a fertile period for that, because I think it's that exciting moment where the need for it has been widely recognized and articulated, but the solution or the solutions are still in development. And so I think that the next year or so is going to be really critical for that. And it's something that I would love to see more organizations working on. I would love for us to be supporting however we can, because I think that all of the, the best policies and practices in the world, without being able to assess them and make sure that they're actually working, are worth a lot less. And I think that it's part of the, process for all of us to be continuously learning, because as we develop new approaches to governing AI, we're not going to get everything right the first time. And I think that this is, it's very clear there's been a lot of challenges and there's been a lot of setbacks. And so to the extent that we can build in these kind of learning processes and assessment and iteration, and be able to be agile and to see the real world results of our interventions, and then adjust our strategies and our tactics accordingly, that to me at a kind of meta level is absolutely critical to the development of responsible AI.
As a matter of fact, the point that when you said that a lot of work or rather you implied that a lot of work is yet to be done in this space. The example that came to my mind in the sustainability space, for example, or sustainable finance or social finance space, the entire concept of outcome-based funding. So pay for success, outcome-based funding, which sort of marries the need to monitor and measure impact and then fund accordingly. So it would be interesting to probably explore how the field of AI and AI deployment can be weaved into such a outcome-based, how it is possible. I don't have the ideas on top of my mind right now. Just that this sort of thing came, and probably this is how 10 years ago someone may have spoken about the outcome-based funding model also. That's a thought at the top of the mind, but let's see how one can work it out.
It's a great idea, and I think it's worth thinking more about. And I'll add to that. One of the things that when I was focusing a lot of the electricity sector was really rising up the kind of agenda was the idea of performance-based regulation. And there are a couple of different interpretations of that. But one of them is that essentially it sounds very intuitive, but it's a little bit more hard to do. But you essentially regulate for the outcomes that you want. So instead of, for example, compensating an electric utility on the basis of how much capital it spends, which is shockingly, essentially how regulated utilities are compensated in the US and the UK. It's a sort of guaranteed rate of return on how much capital they shovel out the door. The idea was to incentivize other things like, how much efficiency, how much downtime is there on the wires throughout the year. The less downtime, the more compensation. Worker safety has been factored in the UK. And I think that with AI regulation, we should be thinking similarly, and same for some of the assessments. So looking at really what are the results that we want to see, and then working backwards from there to think, okay, what are the policies and what are the incentives? So I love the idea of payment for results in this space, and we should definitely think more about that. And if any of your viewers, have ideas about that, they should absolutely reach out.
Now, Mark, I'm tempted to put you in a sticky spot here. I would have wanted a longer answer from you, but there's a reason why I'm putting you in a sticky spot, that regulations and market forces, these are two elements that compel or make companies change from status quo, whether it is responsible business tactics, sustainable business tactics, ethical use of new technologies issues, responsible technology issues. Of these two elements, regulation and market forces, in your view, since you interact with so many companies, do you think it is a 50-50 between the two, that half and half, both are equally important in driving companies to change? Or do you think it will be 75% regulation, 25 market forces, or vice versa? Your view on this number? I'm putting you in a slightly tricky spot, a very undiplomatic way probably.
Well, let me give you an unsatisfyingly complicated answer, but I'll try to be brief, which is that I think that it's actually changed. I think that over the last 5 to 10 years, market forces were absolutely predominating in terms of companies and industries, sort of drivers of what they were developing and how. And I think that is because it was a very lightly regulated space, and because the market forces were very strong. It was very clear what the value propositions were that AI could bring to companies that developed it or that implemented it. And so I would say, hitherto, definitely market forces were predominating in terms of how strongly they were impacting the behavior of companies and others. I think that has changed, and I don't know the exact percent, but I think in the last couple of years, some people have called it the tech lash, others have called it other things. We saw just 2 or 3 weeks ago, the CEOs of Facebook, Apple, Google, Amazon hauled in front of Congress to talk not specifically about AI ethics, but looking at questions of antitrust and competition and other things. And I think that we are now seeing that regulation is really having a very big impact, or at least the threat of regulation or the possible regulations that may come on kind of firm behavior and firm decision making around what products to develop, how to develop them, etc. And the last thing I'll say, so I don't know the exact numbers for these things, but one thing that I have seen in the sustainability and the electricity and the climate space that I'm seeing in the AI space as well, which I think will help answer your question in a slightly different way. What's really challenging for companies is uncertainty. Regulation obviously can be challenging. Overly restrictive regulation or regulation that's unclear, it's challenging, and it can eat into companies' business lines and profits. But what's really hard is not knowing what regulations may come tomorrow, because it makes it very hard to make the kind of long-term decisions of capital allocation and investment that companies need to make to be able to be ahead of the curve, to be competitive in 5-10 years. And so what I would say is, the best thing that I think, governments can do is to just try to get very clear on what the parameters are, what the regulations are going to be, what the policies are going to be. It may not always be easy to do that. Obviously the technology is changing, but I think that if some of those regulatory questions can be hammered out and figured out, actually, this will be to the benefit of industry, and then market forces can really be sort of what becomes the key driver of differentiation, of different products and different companies. And so it's a complicated question, though. I mean, it's a mixture of the two.
So, as a matter of fact, your answer reminded me of the proverb that known devil is better than an unknown one. Mark, as a concluding question, maybe to wrap up. Very quickly, if I have to break up the technology process into stages, so you have the design stage, you have the development stage, and then the application and deployment stage. So the issue of ethics and ethical use of technology, in your view, is the most biggest in which of these stages, or it is equal all across? What's your view on that?
I'm going to answer your question with a not satisfying but hopefully useful answer, in terms of not saying one or the other. What I think that this responsible use and ethical AI issue set has shown us is that we actually need to have much greater integration between those different phases of the technology development cycle. It's no longer tenable to have those happening in silos in the way that they used to. Of course, the best companies have always had very strong customer feedback, feeding into the design process, and this is how you get, products that people love. Apple is a great example of that. But I think that what we're seeing now is that if you have these things happening in silos, you just cannot, have the level of input and kind of feedback that you need to have to make sure that the design phase is taking into account, people's preferences and people's desires and people's needs. The development phase is, accounting for all the potential misuses that, could ultimately happen in the implementation phase. And so one thing I think that the best companies are doing right now in the ethical AI space is to actually just start to build in many more feedback loops between those parts of the product development process. And to me, I think that that's very exciting, because I think it's going to make products more responsible and more ethical. And I'm hopeful that it's also just going to make products better, because there's just a lot more information flow, much more tight coupling between these different phases of product design and deployment. And if things go in a bad direction, I think companies that have that kind of feedback system in place, they'll find out much more quickly. They'll be able to limit the damage. They'll be able to kind of pivot and adjust on an accelerated basis. And I think that will also be good kind of for reputation, for competitiveness, etc.
Which actually brings us back full circle to the issue of checks and balances. But Mark, it was fascinating talking with you and hearing a lot of your insights and inputs on all of these various issues. I thank you for giving us the time, and I wish you a very good day ahead. Thank you.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure. I appreciate the opportunity, and I would encourage viewers, if they would like to learn more about our work, to check out our website, weforum.org, and can feel free to reach out to myself or my colleagues if you want to get involved or learn more.